My name is Eleanor Vance, and for the past 4 years, I have been living in the quiet echo of a life that once was. My home, a sprawling cedar and stone house nestled in the hills overlooking Port Blossom, was the house my husband, Richard, and I designed together. Every window was placed to catch the morning light, every beam in the vaulted ceiling a testament to the future we planned to build. We did build it for 36 years. We filled it with the boisterous laughter of our son, Leo, the scent of baking bread, the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's souls. We also built a business from the ground up, Vance and Sterling Design, a name that became synonymous with quiet elegance and uncompromising quality in our corner of the Pacific Northwest. Richard has been gone for 4 years now, taken by a sudden, merciless illness that left no room for goodbyes. The silence he left behind was a physical presence, a weight in the air that I learned to carry. The house, once our shared sanctuary, became my beautiful, lonely fortress. My life became a small, quiet thing, measured by the blooming of the Livia's pride roses Richard planted for me, and the weekly Sunday dinners with Leo and his wife, Chloe. It was a Monday morning, the kind where a gentle mist hangs over the bay and softens the edges of the world, when the echo of my quiet life was shattered. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the one Richard built from a single slab of reclaimed Douglas fir, nursing a cup of Earl Grey tea and scrolling through emails. An alert from our business bank popped up, a routine notification of a high-value transaction. I almost deleted it. The business had been winding down since Richard's death, with only a few lingering accounts to manage, mostly handled by Leo. But some old habit, the ingrained diligence of a lifetime spent minding the details, made me click it open. My hand trembled as I stared at the screen, the numbers blurring for a moment before snapping into sharp, brutal focus. A charge for $47,000. My heart began a frantic, painful drumming against my ribs. I read the line items, each a tiny, exquisite stab of betrayal. Valerian Atelier, $16,500. Serafina Horlogerie, $21,000. The Azure K Resort, St. Bart's, VIP Suite, $9,500. I sank back in my chair, the solid wood suddenly feeling precarious. The tea in my cup had gone cold, but a hot, creeping shame was spreading up my neck. How could this have happened? How could I have been so blind? The money was staggering, of course. It was more than Richard and I had ever spent on a single vacation in our entire lives. But the deepest cut, the one that took my breath away, came from the text message that had arrived just an hour earlier, a message I had initially read with a gentle, foolish smile. It was from Chloe. Loved the anniversary surprise, Elle. You're just too generous. Leo and I are having the most amazing time. You're the best mother-in-law a girl could ask for. I read it again, the cheerful, cloying words twisting into something monstrous. The casual cruelty of it, the assumption that I would simply absorb this, that I was the sweet, slightly dotty old woman she'd been so carefully cultivating for the past 3 years. Too old to notice, too weak to object, too desperate to maintain the fragile peace with my only son to ever fight back. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Chloe. It was a photo. There she was, lounging on a white sand beach, the turquoise water of the Caribbean a perfect backdrop. She was wearing a new, impossibly small bikini and sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. On her wrist, winking in the tropical sun, was a watch I'd never seen before, a delicate, glittering thing of gold and diamonds. She held up a cocktail in a mock toast, her smile a perfect, radiant mask of satisfaction. I set the phone down, my hand shaking so violently it clattered against the table. I walked to the window overlooking the garden. Richard's roses were in full, glorious bloom, their velvet petals heavy with morning dew. For 4 years, I had tended them alone, just as I had tended to everything else. The house felt too big, the quiet too profound, but it was mine. At least, I had thought it was secure. The credit card had been in my wallet, in my purse, tucked away in the hall closet. When could she have taken it? The memory surfaced, sharp and sickening. Last Sunday's dinner. She had insisted on helping me clear the table, her movements full of a bustling, solicitous energy. When they were leaving, she'd given me a hug, pressing close, her arm around my shoulders. Her other hand, I now realized, must have dipped into my purse hanging on the coat rack. The thought made my skin crawl. I had been so grateful for any scrap of affection from her, so desperate to feel a part of my son's new life. 3 years. For 3 years, I had tried to win Chloe over. I complimented her ever-changing hair colors, praised her experimental cooking, and nodded along to her strong opinions, even when they felt like small, sharp stones thrown at the life Richard and I had built. When she'd suggested in front of Leo that I was getting a bit forgetful, I'd laughed it off with a self-deprecating wave of my hand. When she'd rolled her eyes at my stories of the early days of our business, I'd quietly stopped telling them. When she'd made comments about how vintage and overwhelming my house was, I had actually found myself looking at brochures for minimalist downtown condos. All of it, every concession, every swallowed retort, was for Leo. My son. My only child, who once ran to me with scraped knees and whose small hand I'd held at his father's funeral as he promised he would never, ever leave me alone. But somewhere along the way he had. He hadn't moved away, but he had drifted into Chloe's orbit, a place where I was a distant, slightly embarrassing moon. The landline rang, its shrill summons jarring me from my spiraling thoughts. Leo's name appeared on the caller ID. For a breathless moment, a foolish hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe he knows. Maybe he found out and he's calling to fix this. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, my voice a stranger to my own ears, thin and reedy. "Hey, Mom." He sounded far away, the connection tinged with the slight crackle of a long-distance call. "Listen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to just be straight with me." My grip on the receiver tightened. "Of course, Leo. What is it?" "Chloe says you gave her your card for our anniversary trip. She said you insisted on treating us, but now she's worried you might be, well, having second thoughts about how much it all cost. She feels terrible, thinks you might be upset." The lie was so audacious, so perfectly constructed to paint me as the villain, a fickle, confused old woman who couldn't keep track of her own generous impulses. And worse, so much worse, was the simple fact that my son, my Leo, believed her. He hadn't even questioned it. "Leo," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I never gave anyone permission to use my credit card." A heavy silence stretched across the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with the weary frustration I had come to know so well. "Mom, come on. Chloe even showed me the thank you note you left with the card. She said you were excited to surprise us." "What note?" "I never wrote any note." "Maybe you forgot," he said, his tone softening into one of patronizing concern. "You've been under a lot of stress. And you know, Dr. Evans did say that profound grief can sometimes affect short-term memory." Dr. Evans, my family physician for 20 years. When had Leo spoken to him? And why? "I remember perfectly well what I have and have not done," I replied, a sharp edge entering my voice that I hadn't used in years. "Someone used my credit card without my permission. That's called theft, Leo." Another pause, longer this time. "Look, can we talk about this when we get back? I don't want to ruin the trip over a simple misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" The words escaped me, hot and incredulous. $47,000 is not a misunderstanding. 47. His voice trailed off. He sounded genuinely shocked. "Mom, that's not. Chloe said it was just for the hotel and maybe a nice dinner. A few thousand, tops." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear something in his tone, a tiny crack in the foundation of the story Chloe had built for him. "Leo," I said quietly, my own voice surprising me with its newfound steadiness. "When you get home, take a look at your wife's new watch. Ask her where the Valerian handbag came from. And then ask yourself if a few $1,000s could buy a week-long vacation in one of the most expensive resorts in the world." I hung up the phone before he could answer, my hand shaking so badly I could barely place the receiver back in its cradle. The silence that rushed back in felt different now. This wasn't the gentle quiet of loneliness, it was the hollow, ringing echo of profound betrayal. I had spent 3 years trying to purchase a love that was never for sale, bartering my dignity for an acceptance that was never on offer. But as I stood there, staring at the email on my laptop screen, something else began to stir beneath the hurt and humiliation. It was a cold, quiet anger, an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. It made me sit down, put on my reading glasses, and look very, very closely at the details of that bank alert. Because there was something Chloe didn't know. Something she couldn't possibly have known in her greedy, careless haste. She had picked the wrong card. She hadn't stolen from Eleanor Vance, the grieving widow. She had stolen from Vance and Sterling Design, a legally incorporated entity. And that single, crucial detail was about to change everything. Sleep was a stranger to me that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Chloe's smug, smiling face from that beach photo, heard the saccharine sweetness in her voice as she called me Elle. How had I not seen it? How had I let myself be so thoroughly managed? The memories, now unfiltered by my desperate need for family harmony, came flooding back. The first red flag had been at their wedding. Chloe had accidentally forgotten to place me at the main family table. I'd spent the reception seated with some of Richard's distant cousins, watching my son toast his new bride from across a crowded room. Chloe had met my eyes only once, a brief, dismissive glance before turning away. It was just a mistake with the seating chart, Mom. She was so stressed, Leo had said later, his face etched with apology. And I, of course, had understood. My capacity for understanding had been my greatest weakness. Then came the slow, methodical erasure from their life's narrative. The family photos I was never quite in. Oh, we were just grabbing a quick one. Chloe would chirp, phone in hand, after she and Leo had posed for a selfie. We'll get one with you in a minute. But the minute never came. Their social media was a curated gallery of a perfect, parentless couple. I remembered the first Christmas after they were married. I had spent weeks knitting a beautiful merino wool throw for their living room, in a soft slate blue that Chloe had once admired. She'd unwrapped it, held it up for a fraction of a second, and said, "How rustic." "Thank you, Eleanor." She'd then folded it and set it aside. The next time I visited, I saw it balled up in the dog's bed. But the memory that truly twisted in my gut was from the previous Mother's Day. I'd invited them for brunch, spending all morning making Leo's childhood favorites, sourdough pancakes, maple-cured bacon, a fresh berry compote. Chloe arrived and immediately began taking artfully arranged photos of the food. So charmingly homemade, she'd captioned one on her Instagram, a caption I saw later that day. "Love these authentic moments with the older generation." She'd made my love and effort sound like a visit to a living history museum. My son, my own son, had laughed and encouraged her, utterly blind to the way his wife was diminishing me, one condescending post at a time. It was at that same brunch that she had planted the most poisonous seed. "Leo and I have been thinking about our future," she'd announced, daintily cutting a single strawberry. "We're probably going to need a bigger house soon. Something more modern, you know? With better accessibility features." She'd glanced meaningfully around my home, the home Leo grew up in, the home filled with Richard's craftsmanship and our shared history. "Of course, we'd want to stay close enough to help Eleanor when she needs it," she'd added, her voice dripping with counterfeit concern. People at a certain age, they really shouldn't be living all alone in a big place like this. "It's not safe." "I am perfectly fine living alone," I'd said, my voice tighter than I intended. "Oh, I know you think you are," Chloe had replied, her smile never faltering. "But things can change so quickly. Memory issues, falls, forgetting medications. It's something Leo and I worry about constantly." I remembered Leo's expression, how he looked from his wife to me, a new, assessing quality in his gaze. He wasn't looking at his mother, he was looking at a potential problem, a future burden. The seed was planted, and Chloe had been watering it diligently ever since. There was the time she'd helpfully reorganized my purse at a restaurant, then made a great show of how jumbled and confusing everything was. The way she'd begun speaking to me in a slightly louder, slower voice in public, as if I were deaf or slow-witted. The concerned little comments to their friends, just within my earshot, about how I'd repeated a story. And then there were the financial probes, always cloaked in kindness. Have you thought about setting up automatic bill payments, Elle? It would be so much less for you to worry about. Maybe we should find you a good financial advisor, just to help manage things. You know, you could add Leo to your bank accounts, just for emergencies. In case something were to happen. I had resisted, some deep, primal instinct for self-preservation screaming at me to maintain my independence. But I had been getting tired. The constant, gentle pressure was wearing me down. She had used my grief as her primary tool, turning every mention of Richard into an opportunity to frame me as fragile and lost. "It's so hard when they lose their life partner," she would say to others, patting my hand with theatrical sympathy. "They can become a bit disconnected from reality. It's completely understandable, but it does make you worry." Now, sitting in my silent kitchen in the dead of night, the pattern was hideously clear. Every gesture of love I'd made had been catalogued as evidence of my decline. Every attempt to hold on to my life had been painted as stubborn denial. Chloe hadn't just been dismissive or unkind, she had been running a campaign. I opened my laptop. It was time to stop remembering and start investigating. I logged into the online portal for Vance and Sterling Design, something I hadn't done myself in over a year. I pulled up the statements for the company credit card, the one issued to Leo for legitimate business expenses related to dissolving the company. What I found made my blood run cold. This wasn't the first time. The theft hadn't started with a $47,000 trip to the Caribbean. It had started 8 months ago. A $700 charge at a high-end salon. A $1,500 charge at a designer shoe store. A series of expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of, all meticulously coded as client meetings or project supplies. It was a long, slow siphoning, a test of the waters to see how much she could get away with before anyone noticed. The trip wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was a triumphant finale. But as I scrolled through months of fraudulent charges, my horror began to crystallize into something else. A cold, hard certainty. The card was a corporate card, tied to a registered S corporation. The purchases were falsely documented as business expenses. This wasn't just credit card theft. This was wire fraud, tax fraud, corporate malfeasance. And those were crimes that the federal government took very, very seriously. I closed the laptop and leaned back in Richard's chair. For 3 years, I had been playing a game of emotional chess with a master manipulator, and I had been losing badly. I'd been so focused on not losing my son that I had allowed his wife to rob me, piece by piece, of my money, my dignity, and my own sense of self. But Chloe, in her arrogance, had made a fatal error. She had assumed I was only what she saw on the surface, a lonely, grieving widow who was fading into irrelevance. She had never once considered the woman I was before Richard's death. The woman who had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, stared down intimidating contractors, and managed the complex finances of a thriving business for over 30 years. She had forgotten that I was Eleanor Vance, co-founder and president of Vance and Sterling Design. For the first time in a long time, a real smile touched my lips. It wasn't the placating, gentle smile I reserved for Chloe. This one was sharp. This one had teeth. Chloe had been playing checkers with a ghost. It was time for her to learn that I was very much alive, and I knew how to play chess. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 4 years. I put on a power suit. It was a charcoal gray St. John knit, a suit I'd worn to close our biggest deal back in 2012. It still fit. I styled my silver hair not in its usual soft bob, but swept back in a sleek, no-nonsense chignon. I applied my makeup with a steady hand, adding a slash of classic red lipstick. The woman who looked back at me from the mirror was not the softly blurred widow of recent years. It was Eleanor Vance. And she was going to work. My first stop was the downtown office of our longtime accountant, David Chin. David was a quiet, meticulous man who had handled our corporate and personal finances for 2 decades. When I walked into his office, his receptionist, a young woman named Maya, looked up in surprise. "Mrs. Vance, we weren't expecting you." "Good morning, Maya. Is David available?" "It's urgent." David emerged from his office, his brow furrowed with concern. "Eleanor, it's good to see you. Is everything all right?" "No, David, it's not," I said, walking past him into his office and sitting in one of the client chairs. I need you to pull all the corporate credit card statements for Vance and Sterling for the past 12 months. I also need a summary of the potential legal and financial ramifications of corporate fraud. David's eyebrows shot up. Fraud. I believe the company has been used to finance a significant amount of personal spending, falsely coded as business expenses. He didn't ask questions. He simply turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Within minutes, the statements were populating on the large monitor on his wall. We went through them, line by painful line. The salon, the boutiques, the restaurants, the final, audacious trip. This is extensive, David said, his voice grim. The card was issued to Leo, as an authorized officer, for the purpose of winding down the business. Leo is not the one who made these purchases, I said. I pulled out my phone and showed him the picture Chloe had sent from the beach, the glittering Serafina watch prominent on her wrist. This watch was purchased 2 weeks ago. For $21,000. It was coded as final asset liquidation consulting fees. David's face darkened. Eleanor, this is serious. If someone is intentionally misrepresenting personal expenses as business costs on a corporate account, that's a felony. We're talking about potential investigation by the IRS, significant fines, and, depending on the amount and intent, possible jail time. I absorbed this, a knot of dread and determination tightening in my stomach. The dread was for my son, who was, at best, criminally negligent and, at worst, complicit. The determination was for myself. What's our first step? I asked. Legally, the corporation must report the fraud to protect itself from liability. We need to file a report with the police and the credit card company immediately. I'll also need to prepare a disclosure for the IRS. We have to get ahead of this. His voice was firm, the voice of a man who understood risk. And Leo? That depends entirely on his level of knowledge. If he was unaware, he's a victim of identity theft, though he'll have to answer for his lack of oversight. If he knew, if he was complicit in any way, he's just as liable as the person who swiped the card. I thought of my son's voice on the phone, the initial defense of Chloe, followed by the flicker of doubt when I mentioned the dollar amount. He didn't know. I was sure of it. He had been played just as I had. I need to speak with him first, David, I said. Before we file anything. Give me 48 hours. David looked pained. Eleanor, from a legal standpoint, every hour we wait increases the company's exposure. 48 hours, I repeated, my voice leaving no room for argument. Then we do what we have to do. He sighed and nodded. All right. But I'm freezing that card, effective immediately. Not one more cent can be charged to it. I spent the rest of the day in a quiet corner of David's office, making calls, reviewing old corporate bylaws, and preparing a file. By the time I left, I had a complete, documented timeline of the theft, totaling over $68,000. That evening, I drove to the sleek, modern townhouse that Leo and Chloe rented. I still had a spare key they'd given me for emergencies. This, I decided, qualified. I wasn't there to snoop for evidence. David and I had all the proof we needed. I was there to understand. Their home was a monument to aspirational living. A white leather sofa that looked like it had never been sat on. Abstract art on the walls that was likely worth more than my car. A gleaming kitchen with appliances that looked like they belonged in a professional restaurant. But as I walked through the silent rooms, I saw the cracks in the facade. On the polished granite countertop, there was a stack of mail. I nudged it with my finger. A red-stamped, past-due notice from the company that leased Chloe's late-model SUV. A credit card bill with a staggering balance and a highlighted minimum payment. A letter from their landlord regarding a rent check that had been returned for insufficient funds. They were drowning. They were living a life of champagne tastes on a beer budget, and my money, Richards, and my legacy had become their secret lifeline. I went upstairs to their master bedroom. On Chloe's vanity sat a large, lacquered jewelry box. I opened it. Inside, nestled on black velvet, were pieces I now recognized from the credit card statements. Diamond earrings from March. A delicate gold necklace from May. The Serafina watch from 2 weeks ago. A thief's treasure chest. But the real discovery was in the bottom drawer of her bedside table. It was a simple, beige file folder, labeled in Chloe's neat, loopy handwriting, L. Financials. My hands shook as I opened it. It was a meticulously compiled dossier. Printouts of my home's property records, with its assessed value circled in red. Copies of Richard's obituary, with the mentions of Vance and Sterling Design highlighted. And then, the internet search histories. Legal requirements for power of attorney in Washington state. Signs of early onset dementia. Contesting a will. How to be added to elderly parents' bank accounts. At the very bottom of the folder was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten timeline. Phase 1. Establish pattern of forgetfulness/confusion, 6 to 8 months. Complete. Phase 2. Gain access to smaller accounts, test limits, summer. In progress. Phase 3. Secure power of attorney by year-end. Phase 4. Full asset management/transition to assisted living, 18 to 24 months. I had to sit down on the edge of their perfectly made bed. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't just about funding a lavish lifestyle. This was a long-term, calculated plan to strip me of everything. My home, my money, my autonomy, my mind. The credit card theft wasn't the endgame, it was just a step along the way. I took out my phone and, with trembling hands, photographed every single document in that folder. Then I put everything back, exactly as I had found it, and let myself out of the house, locking the door behind me. Back home, I poured myself a small glass of Richard's favorite single malt scotch, the one we saved for special occasions. Chloe wasn't just a thief. She was a predator. She had identified me as weak prey and had been patiently, systematically setting her trap for years. But she had miscalculated. She had mistaken my grief for senility, my desire for peace for weakness. She had never considered that the quiet widow in the big house on the hill still had the mind of the woman who had built an empire beside her husband. My phone buzzed. A text from Leo. Landing tomorrow night. We need to talk. I smiled as I typed my reply, the scotch warming my veins, clearing the last of the fog from my mind. Yes, we do. Come for dinner on Sunday. And bring Chloe. There are some business matters we all need to discuss. I hit send and took a sip of scotch. Sunday was going to be very interesting indeed. Sunday evening arrived with a cool, salt-laced breeze from the bay, a perfect Port Blossom autumn night. The scent of pot roast, Leo's favorite since he was a boy, filled the house. This meal wasn't an olive branch, it was a stage, and I was the director. They arrived precisely at 7. Chloe swept in, radiating a sun-kissed glow, wearing a new dress I was certain had been purchased on her Caribbean surprise vacation. The Serafina watch glittered on her wrist as she wrapped me in a brittle hug. "Eleanor, you look wonderful," she said, her voice like warm honey. "I hope you weren't too worried about us. I know how you can get when you can't reach Leo." The little dig was delivered flawlessly, another brick in the wall of my supposed frailty. I smiled my old, placid smile. "I'm just glad you're home safe. Come in, sit down. Dinner is ready." At the dining table, under the warm glow of the chandelier Richard and I had salvaged from an old hotel, I watched my son. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been a week ago. He barely looked at Chloe, his gaze shifting between his plate and me, a silent tension coiled in his shoulders. Something had happened in St. Bart's after my phone call. "So, tell me all about your trip," I said, serving the roast. "The photos you sent were just beautiful." Chloe launched into a breathless monologue about the resort, the food, the idyllic beaches. She was a masterful storyteller, painting a picture of perfect, carefree luxury. She was also careful to avoid any mention of cost. "The suite was divine," she said, "and the shopping, oh well, the boutiques were heavenly. So chic." "I'm sure," I said. "And that watch is just stunning. Is it new?" She held up her wrist, admiring the play of light on the diamonds. "This old thing? I've had it for ages. Though I did pick up a few little trinkets while we were away. You know how it is." The lie was so smooth, so effortless. I glanced at Leo. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. He knew. "Actually," I said, placing my napkin in my lap. "There was something I wanted to talk to you both about." I was reviewing some financial statements with my accountant, and we found some irregularities. Chloe's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Her smile remained, but it was now a brittle, painted thing. Oh? What sort of irregularities? Corporate credit card charges, I said calmly. Very large ones. For things I don't recall approving as business expenses. The silence that fell was heavy enough to feel. Leo put his fork down and looked directly at his wife for the first time all evening. Chloe, you told me Mom gave you the card. You said she left you a note. I watched her face. For a split second, a flicker of pure panic. Then the mask of wounded innocence snapped back into place. She did. Eleanor, you must remember. You pressed it into my hand when we were leaving last Sunday. You said you wanted us to have the trip of a lifetime, that Richard would have wanted you to be generous. Invoking Richard's name was a low blow, a tactic designed to destabilize me with grief. It had worked before. It did not work tonight. That's fascinating, I said, reaching for the file folder I'd placed on the sideboard. I opened it and slid the top statement across the polished wood of the table. Because according to these records, the card you used wasn't my personal Visa. It was the Vance and Sterling Design Corporate American Express. The one that's still an active, legal entity subject to federal and state tax laws. Leo's face went white. Mom, I thought the business was closed. It's being wound down, Leo, not dissolved. Which means every single purchase must be a legitimate, documented business expense. I tapped a highlighted line item. Can either of you explain to me how a $21,000 Serafina watch qualifies as a deductible expense for an interior design firm? Chloe's composure finally fractured. This is ridiculous. It was a mix-up with the cards. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. $68,000 is not a molehill, Chloe, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal intensity. It's grand larceny and corporate fraud. The word fraud hung in the air. Leo shoved his chair back, the legs screaming in protest against the hardwood floor. 68,000? Mom, on the phone you said 47. That was just the trip. The theft has been going on for months. I laid the rest of the statements out like a losing hand of poker. August, $500 at a spa. July, $2,000 at a designer boutique. June, a $1,200 handbag. All of it, every penny, disguised as business expenses on an account I looked at my son, are legally responsible for. Leo stared at the papers, then at his wife, who seemed to be shrinking in her chair. You've been using Mom's company card for months, he whispered. It wasn't a big deal, she snapped, her voice high and defensive. She has more money than she knows what to do with. That business was just sitting there. A business that could get us both audited by the IRS. Leo's voice rose, cracking with disbelief. A business that I am an officer of. Chloe, do you have any idea what you've done? What I've done? Her voice turned venomous. What about her? Sitting in this huge, empty house, hoarding all that money while we can barely make our rent. She's your mother. She should want to help us. By stealing from her? Leo paced to the window, his back to us. By committing felonies in my name? I watched the scene with a profound and terrible sadness. My son was finally seeing the truth, but the price of that clarity was the destruction of his world. There's more, I said quietly. I took out my phone and slid it across the table to Leo. I'd queued up the photos of the documents from Chloe's folder. He scrolled through them, his face hardening with each image. The property records. The articles on dementia. When he reached the photo of her handwritten timeline, he let out a short, sharp laugh devoid of any humor. Phase 3, secure power of attorney by year-end, he read aloud. Phase 4, full asset management. He looked up at his wife, and I saw the precise moment the love in his eyes died, replaced by a cold, barren emptiness. You were planning to take everything. To have my mother declared incompetent. Chloe's face was blotchy, her composure shattered. It's not like that. I love you, Leo. I was doing it for us. For our future. No, he said, his voice flat and dead. You were doing it for you. You spent 3 years convincing me my own mother was losing her mind. You turned me against her. She was never there for you. Chloe was desperate now, flinging accusations like daggers. Always working, always busy with the business. She left you with nannies. She doesn't deserve your loyalty. Stop. The word from Leo was like a whip crack. He turned from the window, his face a mask of stone. Don't you dare talk about my mother that way. She and Dad worked to give us everything. They built a business that put me through college, that gave us the foundation for this. He gestured vaguely at the life he now realized was a lie. A foundation that's about to crumble, Chloe spat back. We're going to lose everything now, aren't we? All because you can't stand up to your mommy. I stood up slowly, feeling the strength return to my limbs. Actually, Chloe, I said, my voice clear and steady. What happens next depends entirely on you. They both stared at me. Leo with a flicker of hope. Chloe with a wary, calculating glint in her eye. My accountant and I have prepared a settlement agreement, I said. The fraud has not yet been officially reported. This can all be handled as a private family matter. Or it can be handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office. The choice is yours. For the first time in 3 years, I held all the cards. I was no longer the grieving widow. I was Eleanor Vance, and I was taking my life back. The silence in my dining room was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a palpable force, thick with the wreckage of a marriage and the stark reality of consequences. Chloe stood frozen, her designer dress suddenly looking like ill-fitting costume armor. Leo remained by the window, his silhouette a study in disillusionment. What kind of settlement? Chloe asked, her voice strained, the first tactical question from a mind that was always calculating angles. I returned to my chair and placed the manila folder on the table between us. I had spent the better part of Friday with a lawyer David had recommended, a sharp, sensible woman who specialized in corporate law. The documents inside were ironclad. First, I began, my tone cool and professional, the one I used to use in difficult negotiations. You will return every single item purchased with company funds. The watch, the handbag, the jewelry, the clothes. I have itemized credit card receipts for everything. Chloe's hand flew instinctively to her new watch. That's not possible. Some of it. I've worn it. It's not new anymore. Then you will liquidate what you can, and you will repay the difference in cash, at full retail value, I said, my gaze unwavering. You will sell your car. You will get a second job. I don't particularly care how you do it, but Vance and Sterling will be made whole. With what money? She scoffed, a hint of her old defiance returning. You saw our bills. We're broke. A problem of your own making. I slid the first document out of the folder. The alternative is a federal indictment. I imagine it's difficult to earn an income from a prison cell. Leo turned from the window. Mom. What else? This was the hardest part, the part that wasn't just about money. I pulled out a second document. Chloe will sign this promissory note for the full amount of the theft, which, with interest and penalties, comes to $72,350. It will be repaid in monthly installments over the next 5 years. That's over $1,000 a month, she gasped. We can't afford that. You should have considered that before your shopping sprees, I said flatly. There's more. You will also sign this legally binding confession, detailing the unauthorized use of corporate funds and the misrepresentation of those funds for tax purposes. I will hold it in trust. It's my insurance policy against any future lapses in your memory about what happened here. Her face, beneath its expensive foundation, was the color of ash. You're trying to ruin me. No, Chloe. You ruined yourself. I'm just building a firewall to ensure you can't ruin anyone else. I took a deep breath and pulled out the final sheet of paper. And finally, you will agree, in writing, to have no further contact with me. Ever. No phone calls, no texts, no Sunday dinners. You will not come to my home or my place of business. You will remove me from your life. You can't do that. She shot to her feet. You can't just cut me off. What about Leo? What about future grandchildren? It was a desperate, last-ditch play. I looked at my son, saw the deep, unabiding pain in his eyes, but also something else I hadn't seen in years. Clarity. Leo is my son, I said, my voice softening for the first time. He will always be my son, and he will always be welcome in my home. But you, Chloe, have proven that you are a danger to my well-being. I will not allow you in my life. This boundary is not negotiable. This is crazy, she said, pacing now. You're breaking up our marriage over a simple misunderstanding. I'm not doing anything to your marriage, I corrected her. I am protecting myself from a predator. What you and Leo decide to do is up to you. Leo finally spoke, his voice quiet but resonant with a terrible finality. She's right, Chloe. About everything. Tyson, she cried, her voice cracking. You can't be taking her side. There are no sides anymore, he said, turning to face her fully. There is only the truth. And the truth is, you didn't just steal from my mother. You tried to steal her from me. You lied to me, manipulated me, and made me doubt the one person who has loved me unconditionally my entire life. I did it for us, she pleaded, her eyes welling with tears I knew were as fake as her designer handbag. No, Leo said, his voice hard as iron. You did it for you. I read your plan, Chloe. The folder. The timeline. Were you going to get rid of me, too, once you had control of her money? She stared at him, speechless. She had been so thoroughly, completely exposed that for the first time since I'd met her, she had no lie left to tell. I stood and gathered the documents. You have 24 hours to sign these papers and have them delivered to my lawyer's office. If you do, this remains a private, albeit painful, family matter. If you do not, my accountant and I will proceed with filing a formal criminal complaint on Tuesday morning. And if I don't, she whispered, her last shred of defiance. If I call your bluff? I allowed myself a small, cold smile. Try me. I spent 30 years negotiating with men who would find you charmingly amateur. You are not nearly as formidable as you think you are. Something in my eyes, in my voice, must have finally broken through her delusion. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. She looked around my dining room, at the photos of Leo as a child, at the warm, lived-in comfort of a home built on love, not lies. It was a world she had tried to infiltrate and destroy, and she had failed. This isn't over, she said, but the words were hollow. Oh, yes, it is, I replied softly. She grabbed her purse and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the knob and looked back at me, her face a mask of hate. You'll be sorry. You'll be all alone in this big house, and you'll regret this. I've been alone for 4 years, Chloe, I said. The only difference is, now I don't have to pretend I'm not. She wrenched the door open and slammed it shut behind her, the sound rattling the windows and a lifetime of china in the breakfront. In the ringing silence, Leo and I just looked at each other. Mom, he said, his voice breaking on a sob. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have seen it. I should have known. I went to him and took his hands, the same hands I had held when he was a boy with a fever. She is a very skilled manipulator, Leo. And you wanted to believe in the life you were building. But you're my mother. I should have trusted you. Grief made us both vulnerable, I said, pulling him into a hug, feeling the shuddering breaths he took against my shoulder. I was so afraid of losing you, I let myself be diminished. We both have lessons to learn from this. When he pulled away, his eyes were wet, but his jaw was set. What now? I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time in years, and saw the kind, decent man Richard and I had raised emerge from the fog. Now, I said, placing a hand on his cheek. Now we heal. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed into a space that was entirely new. It filled a living room with clean lines, pale wood floors, and a floor-to-ceiling window that framed a panoramic view of the boats bobbing in the Port Blossom Marina. My new home. A downtown condo, light and airy and blessedly manageable. The day after our confrontation, a courier had delivered the signed and notarized agreements from Chloe. 2 days after that, Leo had moved into my guest room. A week later, boxes began arriving at my old house, the returned spoils of Chloe's theft. The divorce was quiet and swift. Chloe, I heard through the grapevine, had moved to another state, already weaving her web around some other unsuspecting soul. That was no longer my concern. Selling the house on the hill had been the most liberating act of my life. As Leo and I packed the last of the boxes, we sorted through 3 decades of memories. What about this one? He'd asked, holding up a framed photo from their wedding. Trash, I'd said, without a moment's hesitation. We made a new rule. Any photograph, any object that carried the ghost of her presence was purged. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about curating the future. By the time we were done, what remained was pure and true, the story of a family of 3, then 2, a story of love and loss and now resilience. Leo was thriving. He had a new job at a downtown architecture firm, a place that valued his talent and integrity. He had his own apartment now, just a few blocks from mine. The shadows had receded from his eyes, replaced by a calm confidence I hadn't seen since before he'd met Chloe. My own life had bloomed in unexpected ways. I had joined a book club, taken up watercolor painting, and started walking every morning along the waterfront with a group of vibrant, interesting women my age. I was no longer just a widow or a mother. I was Eleanor again. My phone buzzed with a text. It was Leo. Dinner Sunday? My treat. I smiled, looking out at the glittering water. A sailboat was leaving the harbor, its white sail catching the wind, heading for the open sea. I felt a kinship with it. It's a date, I typed back. But I'm buying. I have so much to celebrate. I thought back to that terrible Monday morning, the shock and the shame. It felt like a lifetime ago. Chloe, in her greed and cruelty, had intended to destroy me. Instead, she had given me the greatest gift of all. She had forced me to find the woman I thought I had lost when I lost Richard, the strong, capable, and unyielding woman who had been there all along, waiting quietly in the echo of a life that was, waiting for the silence to break. She had taught me that boundaries are not acts of cruelty, but acts of self-love. She had shown me that true loneliness isn't being alone, but being with people who make you feel alone. And as I stood in my new home, a place filled only with light and a future of my own making, I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that my best years were not behind me. They were just beginning.